The crisp London morning brought a steady stream of tourists to Buckingham Palace, their excited chatter filling the air as cameras flashed against the iconic building's facade. Among them was James Chen, a 27-year-old software engineer from Singapore who had saved for months for this European vacation. He stood out in the crowd with his designer clothes and an expensive camera hanging around his neck. But it wasn't his appearance that would make him memorable that day. James had always been used to getting his way, growing up in a wealthy family and landing a high-paying job straight out of university had only reinforced his sense of entitlement. This trip to London was meant to be the highlight of his social media feed, and he had meticulously planned every photo opportunity. As he approached the palace gates, James noticed the famous royal guard standing perfectly still in his traditional red uniform and tall bearskin hat. The guard's presence made tourists gasp in delight, and many respectfully posed at a distance for photos. But James wanted something different, something that would make his social media followers envious. "Excuse me," he called out to the guard, waving his hand in front of the soldier's face. "I need you to move a little to the left. You're ruining my shot." The guard, as expected, remained motionless, trained by years of discipline to maintain his composure regardless of tourist behavior. A middle-aged British woman nearby frowned at James's actions. "Young man, you shouldn't disturb the guard. They're not here for entertainment," she said firmly. But James merely rolled his eyes and continued his attempts to get the perfect photo. The morning sun grew warmer, and James became increasingly frustrated. He had already spent 30 minutes trying to get his ideal shot, but the guard's position just wouldn't work with his planned composition. He pulled out a can of soda from his expensive designer backpack and drank it quickly, wiping his mouth with the sleeve of his silk shirt. Other tourists watched in disbelief as James's behavior grew more aggressive. He started making funny faces at the guard, trying to provoke a reaction. A group of schoolchildren on a field trip pointed at him, whispering among themselves about the strange man bothering the guard. "Look at this guy, he won't even blink," James complained loudly to no one in particular, pulling out his phone to start recording. "These guards think they're so special." He unwrapped a sandwich he bought earlier, taking large bites while continuing to walk circles around the stoic guard. Sarah Williams, an American tourist who had been watching the scene unfold, pulled out her phone and began recording as well, not the guard, but James' increasingly inappropriate behavior. "This isn't going to end well," she whispered to her husband. The tension in the air was palpable as James finished his sandwich and soda. Instead of looking for a trash bin, a smirk spread across his face. With deliberate slowness, he crumpled up the sandwich wrapper and empty can. Other tourists watched in horror as he held them up high, making sure everyone could see what he was about to do. "Since you're just standing there like a statue," James said loudly, "you might as well be useful." With that, he dropped the trash right at the guard's polished boots. The wrapper fluttered slightly in the breeze before settling on the ground, while the can made a hollow sound as it hit the pavement. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. Several people immediately pulled out their phones, and the rapid clicking of camera shutters filled the air. The guard remained perfectly still, but there was a subtle tightening around his jaw, the only indication that he was aware of the disrespect being shown. James laughed, clearly pleased with himself, and raised his phone to take a selfie with the guard and the trash in the background. "This is going to get so many likes," he said, typing out a caption on his phone. "Just made this guard's job a little more interesting. Hashtag London Life, hashtag Royal Guard, hashtag tourist." Little did James know that his actions in these few minutes would set off a chain of events that would change his life forever. Security cameras silently recorded every moment, and dozens of witnesses had captured his behavior on their phones. In just 15 minutes, his act of disrespect would come back to haunt him in ways he never could have imagined. As James walked away from the scene, feeling smug and satisfied with his clever prank, the wheels of justice were already beginning to turn. The next 15 minutes would prove to be the most consequential of his life, though he didn't know it yet as he strolled toward the palace gates, still chuckling to himself about his hilarious stunt. As James continued his walk around the palace grounds, feeling proud of his actions, several things were happening behind the scenes. In the palace security room, Officer Michael Bennett sat up straight in his chair as he reviewed the footage of James's behavior. With over 15 years of experience protecting the palace, he had seen his share of disrespectful tourists, but something about this incident made his blood boil. "Roberts, come take a look at this," Bennett called to his colleague. Together, They watched the high-definition security footage that clearly showed James's face and his deliberate actions. Bennett picked up his radio and contacted the Metropolitan Police officers patrolling the area. Meanwhile, Sarah Williams, the American tourist who had recorded the incident, was already uploading her video to social media. Her hands shook with anger as she typed out the caption. Entitled Tourist Harasses Royal Guard at Buckingham Palace and Dumps Trash at His Feet. London deserves better than this. Within minutes, the video started gaining traction. The Royal Guard, whose name was William Harrison, remained at his post, maintaining his professional composure. However, his mind was racing with thoughts of similar incidents he had witnessed during his 3 years of service. The trash at his feet was a stark reminder of the disrespect some visitors showed toward British traditions. James, completely unaware of the storm brewing around him, had made his way to the palace gift shop. He was browsing through souvenirs, planning to buy a novelty guard's hat to mock in his next social media post. The shop assistant, Emma Parker, had already seen the video on her phone during her break and recognized him immediately. She discreetly texted her manager about his presence. Outside, a small crowd had gathered around the guard, and several kind tourists were attempting to pick up the trash James had left behind. An elderly British gentleman named George Thompson stepped forward with a handkerchief to carefully remove the rubbish, muttering under his breath about tourists these days. "Did you see what that young man did?" a French tourist asked her companion. In Paris, the police would have arrested him immediately. The conversation spread through the crowd, and more people began sharing their recordings of the incident online. In the palace security office, Officer Bennett had already compiled a comprehensive report. The palace's zero-tolerance policy for harassment of royal guards meant this incident would not go unpunished. He picked up his phone to make a call to his contacts at the Singapore embassy, knowing that diplomatic channels might need to be informed. James, still browsing in the gift shop, pulled out his phone to check his social media. His smug smile began to fade as he noticed his notifications exploding with angry comments. The video of his behavior had already been shared thousands of times, with viewers from around the world expressing their disgust. "Look at this idiot," one comment read. "No respect for tradition or basic human decency." Another comment identified his workplace from his social media profile. "Does Singapore International Finance know their employee behaves like this abroad?" The color drained from James's face as he realized his action wasn't being received as the funny prank he'd intended. He quickly tried to delete his own social media posts about the incident, but screenshots had already been saved and shared widely. As he hurriedly left the gift shop without buying anything, James noticed 2 uniformed Metropolitan Police officers walking purposefully in his direction. His heart began to race as he realized they were looking directly at him. The crowd around him began to thin out, creating a clear path between him and the approaching officers. In those moments, James's mind raced through all the possible consequences he might face. His company's strict code of conduct about employee behavior, his family's reputation in Singapore's close-knit business community, and the potential legal troubles in a foreign country all flashed through his thoughts. The 15 minutes since his disrespectful act were almost up, and James was about to learn that actions have consequences. As the police officers drew closer, he could feel the stares of nearby tourists who recognized him from the viral videos. The proud smirk he had worn earlier was long gone, replaced by a look of growing panic as he realized this funny moment was about to become the biggest mistake of his life. "Mr. Chen," the taller police officer spoke firmly as they reached James. "I'm Officer David Wilson, and this is Officer Rachel Thompson. We need to have a word with you about an incident that just occurred." James's throat went dry as he looked around for an escape route, but the crowd had formed a circle around them, many still recording with their phones. His designer shoes suddenly felt rooted to the spot as the reality of his situation began to sink in. It was just a joke," James stammered, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. Officer Thompson's expression remained stern as she pulled out a tablet showing the security footage of his actions from multiple angles. "Sir, we have clear evidence of you harassing a member of the Queen's Guard and deliberately littering on palace grounds," Officer Wilson stated. "Both are serious offenses under British law." The officer's words caused several onlookers to murmur and point their phones at the unfolding scene. Meanwhile, inside the palace security office, Officer Bennett was on a conference call with the Singapore embassy. "Yes, We have clear footage of the incident, he explained. The subject has been identified as James Chen, employed by Singapore International Finance. On another screen, he watched as the social media storm continued to grow. Back outside, James was being issued a citation for his offenses. His hands trembled as Officer Thompson listed the violations: harassment of a royal guard, littering on protected grounds, and disorderly conduct. The total fine amounts to £5,000. The color drained from James's face at the mention of the amount. £5,000? He squeaked. But that's nearly 9,000 Singapore dollars. Some tourists in the crowd snickered at his distress. Additionally, Officer Wilson continued, "You'll need to make a formal written apology to the Royal Guard Services." He handed James a document outlining the requirements. Failure to comply could result in more severe consequences. As this was happening, Sarah Williams's video had reached Singapore. The timestamp showed it was early evening there, but the offices of Singapore International Finance were still bustling with activity. Martha Lim, the head of human resources, received multiple emails containing links to the viral video. She immediately recognized James as one of their rising junior executives. With a heavy sigh, she began drafting an urgent memo to the board of directors. The company's reputation for professionalism and respect was at stake. Back in London, James's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. His parents, friends, and colleagues were sending messages about the viral videos. His father's message made his heart sink. "Son, you have brought shame to our family. The chairman of your company plays golf with me. How could you do this?" Officer Thompson was now explaining the consequences of his actions. "Your details will be logged in our system. This could affect your future entry into the United Kingdom." James felt his knees weaken as she continued. "And given the viral nature of this incident, you should be prepared for additional consequences." The Royal Guard, William Harrison, was finally relieved of his post by another guard. In the guard's break room, his colleagues had already seen the videos. "Will, you handled it like a true professional," his commanding officer commended him. "Your restraint brings honor to the service." James's social media accounts were now being flooded with messages from around the world. Tourism boards were sharing the video as an example of how not to behave when visiting historical sites. Cultural experts were using it in discussions about respect for traditions and customs. As Officers Wilson and Thompson escorted James to their patrol car for formal processing, he caught glimpses of news crews arriving at the palace gates. His small act of disrespect was rapidly transforming into an international incident. "Please," James begged the officers, "isn't there some way to handle this quietly?" Officer Wilson shook his head. "Mr. Chen, actions have consequences. This isn't something that can be swept under the rug." In the back of the police car, James finally checked his work email. His heart nearly stopped when he saw a message from his CEO. "Emergency board meeting regarding your conduct in London. Video conference scheduled for 9 p.m. Singapore time. Your presence is mandatory." As the police car pulled away from Buckingham Palace, James realized that his 15 minutes of infamy were just the beginning of what would become the most regrettable day of his life. The real consequences were yet to unfold, and they would be far more severe than he could have imagined. At the Metropolitan Police Station, James sat in a stark interview room, his expensive clothes now wrinkled and his confident demeanor completely shattered. Detective Inspector Margaret Hayes sat across from him, reviewing the incident report while security footage played on a screen mounted on the wall. "Mr. Chen," Detective Hayes began, her voice stern but professional, "do you understand that your actions today have violated several British laws?" She laid out photographs showing James's behavior from multiple angles. "We have statements from 23 witnesses, plus palace security footage." James's hands fidgeted with his designer watch, a gift from his parents for his recent promotion, a promotion that now seemed in serious jeopardy. "I understand," he mumbled, barely able to look at the evidence before him. Meanwhile, in Singapore, the boardroom of Singapore International Finance was filled with grim-faced executives. The large screen showed the viral video of their employees' behavior, which had now reached over 5 million views across various platforms. CEO Richard Tan stood at the head of the table, his expression dark. "This is a PR nightmare," the head of public relations explained. "We're receiving calls from media outlets across Asia. Our competitors are already using this to question our company's values and employee standards." She flipped through pages of social media reactions, many calling for James's termination. Back in London, James's phone lit up with a message from his mother. Your father had to leave his golf game early. The other players were showing him the video. We raised you better than this, James. The shame you brought to our family. The message trailed off, leaving James feeling even more desperate. Detective Hayes continued her questioning. We've received a formal complaint from the Royal Guard Services. They take the harassment of their personnel very seriously. She pulled out another document. The palace is considering pressing additional charges. In the station's waiting area, a legal representative from the Singapore embassy had arrived. Mr. Tan Wai Ming listened to the details of the case with growing concern. As a diplomatic official, he had handled many cases involving Singaporean citizens abroad, but this one was particularly troublesome due to its viral nature. This incident goes beyond simple littering or harassment. Detective Hayes explained to both James and the embassy official. It's being viewed as a deliberate show of disrespect to a British institution. The public reaction has been overwhelming. James' mandatory video conference with his company's board was set up in a small office at the police station. The faces of his superiors appeared on screen, their disappointment palpable even through the digital connection. Mr. Chen, CEO Tan began, his voice cold. Your actions have severely damaged our company's reputation. Our phones haven't stopped ringing. Clients are questioning our corporate culture. Partners are expressing concerns. The head of HR, Martha Lim, spoke next. Your employment contract includes clauses about maintaining professional conduct and protecting the company's reputation, both locally and internationally. Your behavior today has violated multiple sections of this agreement. James's throat tightened as he realized his career was unraveling before his eyes. The video conference continued with board members taking turns expressing their dismay and discussing the impact on the company's image. Outside the station, reporters had begun to gather. The story had evolved from a viral social media incident to a legitimate news story about international relations and respect for cultural institutions. Camera crews from British and Singaporean news networks set up their equipment, waiting for statements. Detective Hayes returned with more paperwork. Besides the fines we discussed earlier, you'll be required to attend cultural sensitivity training. She paused, checking another document. And the palace is requesting a formal public apology. As the afternoon wore on, James's social media accounts continued to explode with notifications. His previous posts were flooded with negative comments, and his follower count was dropping rapidly. The funny prank he had planned for his social media had instead turned him into a global symbol of disrespectful tourism. Detective Hayes returned one final time with a decision. Mr. Chen, we're releasing you on bail, but you'll need to surrender your passport. You're required to remain in London until this matter is fully resolved. She slid another form across the table. And these are the conditions you must follow during your stay. The reality of his situation finally hit James fully. His 15 minutes of poor judgment weren't just going to cost him money, they were going to cost him his reputation, possibly his career, and maybe even his future. Released from the police station but confined to London, James found himself checking into a modest hotel, a far cry from the luxury accommodation he'd originally booked. His credit cards were being declined one by one as his company had suspended his corporate accounts, leaving him with limited funds. The evening news across Britain featured his story prominently. BBC News ran a special segment titled Disrespect at the Palace, When Tourism Goes Wrong. The reporter stood outside Buckingham Palace, interviewing tourists and locals about the incident. It's absolutely disgraceful, an elderly British woman told the camera. In my day, people knew how to behave around our institutions. The segment cut to cultural experts discussing the broader implications of disrespectful tourism. In his hotel room, James watched his world crumble through his phone screen. His social media accounts had become unusable, flooded with thousands of angry messages. His LinkedIn profile was being shared across professional networks as an example of how one moment of poor judgment could destroy a career. Meanwhile, at Singapore International Finance, the board had reached their decision. An email arrived in James's inbox with the subject line, Termination of Employment, effective immediately. The formal letter cited breach of conduct and bringing disrepute to the company as grounds for dismissal. His parents sent a video message that made him sink further into despair. His father, usually a proud and confident businessman, looked defeated. "Son, I've had to step down from 3 charity boards today," his father said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "Your actions have affected our entire family's standing in the community." The royal guard he had harassed, William Harrison, was interviewed by a military newspaper. "We face various challenges daily," Harrison stated professionally, "but we maintain our composure because we represent something greater than ourselves." His dignified response only highlighted James's immaturity. Back in Singapore, James's story had become a cautionary tale. Schools were using the video in social studies classes to discuss respect for foreign cultures and the consequences of social media behavior. His alma mater, where he had been scheduled to give a career talk next month, quietly removed his name from their alumni achievement wall. Local news outlets began digging into his past. Old social media posts showing similar disrespectful behavior at other tourist sites surfaced. A former classmate shared a story about James mocking traditional customs during a school trip, painting a picture of a pattern of disrespect rather than a one-time mistake. In his hotel room, James attempted to draft the public apology required by the palace. Every version seemed inadequate. How could he explain his actions? How could he make people understand that 15 minutes of foolishness shouldn't define his entire life? His phone buzzed with a message from his girlfriend in Singapore. "I can't be associated with someone who shows such disrespect to other cultures. I think we need to take a break." Another piece of his life fell away. The Singapore embassy official, Mr. Tan, visited him with more bad news. "The incident has sparked diplomatic discussions," he explained. "You've become an example of why we need stricter cultural education for overseas travelers. The government is distancing itself from your actions." James's mother sent another message. Their family's upcoming vacation to Europe had been cancelled. The travel agency had refunded their money, not wanting to be associated with the family after recognizing their surname from the viral incident. Professional recruiters in Singapore's financial sector started using his case in workshops about personal branding and professional behavior. His name became synonymous with career suicide through social media. One recruiter commented, "It will take years for him to recover from this, if ever." The hotel's receptionist recognized him as he returned from getting a sandwich at a local shop. Her previously friendly demeanor turned cold. Even in a city as large as London, he couldn't escape his newfound infamy. That evening, as James sat alone in his hotel room, he received an email from a former mentor. "I've always warned that character is revealed in small moments. Your moment happened to be captured on camera. The road to rebuilding trust will be long, but it starts with genuine remorse and changed behavior." James looked out his hotel window at the London skyline, realizing that his life would forever be divided into 2 parts: before and after those fateful 15 minutes at Buckingham Palace. The weight of his actions pressed down on him as he understood that the consequences were only beginning to unfold. A week after the incident, James sat in his now downgraded hotel room, staring at his laptop screen. His public apology video, carefully crafted with help from the embassy, had been released the previous day. The comments section was a battlefield of opinions, with few showing any sympathy for his situation. Major news outlets had picked up the story of his formal apology. The Guardian ran a piece titled "From Arrogance to Apology," detailed not just his original offense, but the cascade of consequences that followed. His professional life continued to unravel. Recruitment agencies in Singapore were now using software to flag his name in applications. One recruiter accidentally replied to his job inquiry, "Sorry, but hiring you would be a PR liability for any company in the current climate." Back at Buckingham Palace, tourist guides had incorporated his story into their presentations. "And here," one guide said to her group, "is where the infamous Singapore tourist incident occurred. It serves as a reminder of the importance of respecting our royal institutions." James's father called with more devastating news. "The country club has revoked our family membership," he said wearily. 30 years of membership gone. Your mother can't even face her friends at the weekly tea gatherings anymore." The Singapore Tourism Board had launched a new campaign directly inspired by his actions. "Respect every culture, represent Singapore." Posters featuring proper tourist behavior were plastered across Singapore's airports and tourist centers, and though they didn't name him directly, everyone knew the campaign's origin. His bank account dwindled as legal fees mounted. The palace's lawyers have presented additional documentation about the cultural and institutional damage his actions had caused. The initial £5,000 fine now seemed like a small amount compared to the growing legal costs. Social media continued to haunt him. Someone had created a parody account documenting James Chen's Guide to How Not to Travel, which gained more followers than his original account ever had. Each post mocked his thoughtless behavior with biting sarcasm. His younger sister called, crying. "My university friends found out you're my brother," she sobbed. "Some of them won't talk to me anymore. They say our family must have no values to raise someone like you." The embassy official, Mr. Tan, visited again with a thick folder of documents. The incident has sparked a parliamentary discussion about implementing a social credit system for Singaporean travelers, he explained. "Your case is being cited as the primary example of why such measures might be necessary." James' attempt to distract himself with dating apps proved futile. Someone had created a warning profile about him that appeared when users in Singapore searched his name. "Vigaloair. This is the Buckingham Palace trash guy," it read, complete with screenshots from the viral video. His former company had to issue a public statement distancing themselves from his actions. Singapore International Finance maintains the highest standards of professional conduct and cultural sensitivity. The recent actions of our former employee do not reflect our corporate values. Local businesses in Singapore that had previously featured him in their advertisements quickly removed all traces of his involvement. A gym where he had appeared in promotional materials now used his story in their staff training about handling negative publicity. The psychological toll became evident. James barely slept, jumping at every phone notification, dreading another piece of bad news. His once immaculate appearance had grown disheveled, and the confident swagger he once carried had vanished entirely. A former colleague sent him a message. "Remember when you laughed at that junior staff member for bowing too deeply to clients? Karma has a way of teaching lessons about respect." The message stung because he remembered that incident clearly, one of many moments of arrogance he now regretted. His hotel's staff had started giving him pitying looks. The same receptionist who had been cold to him now seemed to feel sorry for him, watching him shuffle through the lobby like a ghost of his former self. As evening fell over London, James found himself walking past souvenir shops, noticing that some had started selling unofficial merchandise mocking his incident. Keychains with slogans like "Don't be that tourist" featured silhouettes that were clearly meant to be him. In his room that night, James looked at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, barely recognizing the humbled man staring back at him. The realization hit him hard. His 15 minutes of thoughtless behavior had unleashed consequences that would last for years, possibly decades, to come. His story had become a cautionary tale, taught in schools and corporate training sessions about how quickly a life could unravel in the age of social media. 1 month after the incident, James finally received permission to return to Singapore. His arrival at Changi Airport was far different from his usual business-class homecomings. He wheeled his single suitcase through the terminal, keeping his head down as people whispered and pointed. The immigration officer processing his return looked at him longer than necessary, recognition flickering in her eyes. "Mr. Chen," she said formally, stamping his passport with deliberate slowness, "welcome back to Singapore." Her tone made it clear the welcome was merely procedural. His parents had sent their driver instead of coming themselves to pick him up. The familiar family car felt foreign now, and the driver, who had known James since his childhood, maintained an uncomfortable silence throughout the journey. Arriving at his family's home in the prestigious Holland Village area, James found things had changed. His father's prized collection of golf tournament trophies, usually displayed prominently in the living room, had been moved. His own academic achievements and professional awards were conspicuously absent from the walls. "We've had to make some adjustments," his mother explained quietly over a tense dinner. "The neighbors, they talk. Your father's business partners ask questions. It's easier if we don't draw attention to ourselves right now." The family ate in silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging heavy in the air. Later that evening, James discovered his father had removed him as a director from their family company. "It's temporary," his father said, not meeting his eyes. "Until things settle down, we can't risk the company's reputation right now." His attempt to restart his life faced immediate challenges. His condominium's management committee had received complaints from residents who didn't want that tourist living in their prestigious building. He was forced to move to a modest apartment in a less desirable area. Job hunting proved impossible in Singapore's close-knit financial sector. One hiring manager was brutally honest. "Your qualifications are excellent, but when I Google your name, well, we can't have clients associating our firm with that incident." His younger sister called with more fallout. "My wedding planner suggested I not have you as part of the ceremony," she said, crying. "She says photos of you might affect their business if potential clients recognize you. I'm so sorry, brother." Local media had started using his story in their Chinese New Year special reports about shame and family honor. One documentary titled The Price of Pride, When Children Dishonor Their Parents, featured blurred footage of him, with commentary from cultural experts about the impact of his actions on Asian family values. His mother's social circle, once a source of pride and connections, had crumbled. Her regular mahjong group quietly disbanded, reformed without her. The family's domestic helper overheard neighbors referring to their house as "where that disgraceful boy lives." James tried volunteering at local charities to rebuild his reputation, but organizations politely declined his help. One coordinator explained, "We appreciate your interest, but our donors are very image conscious. We can't risk losing their support." His father's 60th birthday celebration, meant to be a grand banquet with hundreds of guests, was scaled down to a small family dinner. Many guests had politely declined, citing various excuses that fooled no one. Even routine activities became challenging. At his regular coffee shop, he overheard young students using his name as a cautionary tale. "Don't be like James Chen," one said to another who was planning a Europe trip. "Remember what happened to him." His former university, which had once proudly claimed him as an alumnus, removed his success story from their website. The career counselor who had mentored him sent a brief email. "Sometimes our greatest lessons come from our biggest mistakes. I hope you find a way forward." The family's domestic helper, who had worked for them for 15 years, gave notice. "Sorry, sir," she told James's mother, "but my other employers say they don't want someone who works in this house." The ripple effects of his actions continued to surprise him with their reach. That night, alone in his new apartment, James looked through old photos on his phone, images of his former life filled with success, respect, and privilege. He had never imagined that 15 minutes of arrogance could destroy decades of family reputation and personal achievement. As he prepared for bed, his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "Those who disrespect others lose respect themselves." The sender was anonymous, but the truth of the words cut deep. James realized that rebuilding his life would take more than just time. It would require a complete transformation of the person he had been. 5 years had passed since the infamous Buckingham Palace incident, and James Chen's life bore little resemblance to his former existence. He sat in a small office in the outskirts of Singapore, where he now worked as a junior administrator at a local trading company, the only place that had given him a chance after hundreds of rejections. His desk displayed no photos, no achievements, no hints of his past life. His colleagues, mostly unaware of his history, knew him as the quiet man who always arrived early and stayed late, working with a humility that seemed almost painful to watch. The viral video, though no longer trending, had become a permanent part of digital history. Tourism courses in universities across Asia used it in their curriculum and corporate training. James's family had slowly begun to rebuild their social connections, but things were different. His father had retired early from his business, choosing a quiet life away from the spotlight. His mother had found a new social circle, but she never spoke about her son's achievements as other mothers did. His sister's wedding had happened 3 years ago. James attended quietly, sitting in the back, carefully avoided in all the official photographs. The wedding photographer had been briefed about the sensitive family situation. The pain of that day still lingered. The prestigious family home in Holland Village had been sold, replaced by a more modest property in a quieter neighborhood. "It's more peaceful here," his father would say, but they all knew the real reason. The old house had become too associated with their family's shame. James' new life had taught him valuable lessons about humility and respect. He volunteered at a local community center teaching English to elderly residents who knew nothing of his past. For the first time in his life, he found satisfaction in helping others without seeking recognition. His old social media accounts remained dormant, replaced by a single, private profile under a slightly different name. His former friends and colleagues had long since moved on, achieving the success he once thought would be his. He followed their lives from a distance, like watching a movie of what his life could have been. Sometimes, tourists at local attractions would recognize him. "Aren't you that guy?" they'd whisper, phones quickly appearing to capture evidence. James had learned to quietly leave such situations, his face burning with familiar shame. His parents had recently celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary. The celebration was intimate, nothing like the grand party they had once envisioned for this milestone. James watched his parents dance, knowing how the past 5 years had aged them beyond their years. The financial world he had once dominated now barely acknowledged his existence. Occasionally, a new employee at his company would discover his story and share it in hushed tones by the water cooler. Management would quickly shut down such discussions, protecting their quiet, hard-working employee. James' apartment, a small one-room unit in a government housing block, was sparsely furnished. His designer clothes and luxury watches had long since been sold to help repay his legal debts. He now lived simply, finding unexpected peace in minimalism. During a recent business trip to Malaysia, a customs officer had recognized his name. "Ah, Mr. Chen," the officer said, checking his passport with extra scrutiny. "We studied your case in our training." James had simply nodded, long accustomed to such moments. His younger sister had recently had her first child. James was allowed to visit, but family photos carefully excluded him. "It's not forever," his sister would say, "just until people forget." But they both knew some things are never forgotten in the digital age. Late at night, James often reflected on that fateful day at Buckingham Palace. 15 minutes of arrogance had cost him everything he once valued: status, wealth, career, and family pride. Yet, paradoxically, it had given him something he never had before: genuine humility and understanding of respect. As he prepared for another quiet weekend, James received a rare dinner invitation from his father. Over a simple meal, his father finally said words James had waited years to hear. "You've changed, son, not in the way we once hoped, but perhaps in the way you needed to." Those 15 minutes in London had indeed changed James Chen's life forever, but not entirely in the way he had first feared. While his past actions continued to haunt him, they had also transformed him from an arrogant young executive into a humble man who understood the true meaning of respect and dignity. As night fell over Singapore, James walked home through quiet streets, at peace with his new life. The man who had once sought attention at any cost now found solace in anonymity, having learned that respect, once lost, takes more than a lifetime to fully regain.